Theresa O'Leary is a former award-winning CBC journalist and now the author of a new book about the craft. It's titled Race to the Cape, The Daring News Chase, The Birth of the Associated Press, and the Journalist at the Heart of It All. In it, she tells the story of the beginnings of modern journalism and the determination to get the news to people as quickly as possible. We reached Theresa O'Leary on Gabriola Island off the coast of British Columbia. Hi, Theresa. Welcome to All in a Weekend.
Hi, Sonali. Great to be here.
What was the inspiration for writing this book?
Well, when I was a child, my father was always telling me stories about Cape Race, Newfoundland. And he would say things like, the AP had a news boat at Cape Race, chasing after the news coming from England on the steamships. And the steamships would throw the news overboard into the ocean, and the AP newsboat crew would chase after them. And as a child, of course, it was a very fascinating story, but I honestly wasn't sure it was true. Then I became a journalist, and in my early 20s, I did some research actually in Montreal at McGill University. This is pre-internet, went deep into the archives there, and found a newspaper article that actually confirmed that what Dad had told me was true. And so I was fascinated at that time, and I tucked it away because I was at the beginning of my journalism career with CBC. So I knew I wouldn't be able to touch it for a while, but I knew one day I would get back to that story. And in the end, I pursued this story because I wanted to know if it was true. And also I wanted to answer some questions. Why did the Associated Press in New York City put a news boat at Cape Race, which is, in the middle of the Atlantic? It's a remote location on the edge of the continent. And so why did they do it? And who at the AP made that decision? And I found out the answers to those questions in my research.
This is a story about the beginnings of the Associated Press, which is a not-for-profit news agency with offices around the world. So what did you discover about its origins?
Well, it's actually quite fascinating because, as a journalist, I never actually ever questioned where the principle or the practice of objectivity came from. I just always assumed it was part of journalism. But when the Associated Press formed in 1846, they did so, and what the AP is and was, there were 6 newspapers in New York, and they were fierce competitors. They were all trying to get information from the Mexican war front. There was a war between the United States and Mexico at the time. And they were all spending a lot of money on pony expresses, getting the dispatches from the military war front to the telegraph offices. And then the telegraph was bringing the information up to New York City very quickly. The telegraph had just been invented 2 years earlier. And so when the Associated Press decided to come together, these 6 newspaper owners who were fierce competitors, they really changed everything, because up until that time, there was only newspapers in journalism, and they were owned by rich, powerful men with political opinions. And there really wasn't news reporting the way we look at it today, And so these newspapers, to save money out of frugality, because the telegraph fees were very expensive because it was a new technology. And so to save money on getting dispatches from the war front in Mexico, they got together. And in the process, they provoked a big change from opinionated news to fact-based news. Because there were 6 opinionated masters of the AP, the news could not be opinionated because they'd all be arguing over the various dispatches coming in.
Yeah.
So they had to remove opinion from it. And what was left was facts. And so it really was the beginning of fact-based news in North America.
Wow. So they agreed to disagree.
They did, for the sake of saving money. It was all about frugality, these guys. And actually, Daniel Craig, who was the first general manager at the AP, he was a rowboat news guy who would go out in the rowboats to chase after the news arriving from England in the steamships off of New York and Boston and Halifax. And he was just unbeatable in chasing.
What does it mean in chasing after? Like, was he chasing after a newspaper? Was he chasing after a story?
Yeah, well, he was chasing after, actually, it's a good point, actually, because it wasn't really stories per se, but it was information. It was the latest news and information from England because there was no transatlantic telegraph. So the only way to get news from the old country was by steamship mail delivery. And so what they were looking for, what might come and be dropped off at Cape Race or from these steamships further south, would be correspondence from the Queen to the President, for instance. It would be very important news that would be dropped off at Cape Race. The price of cotton was huge. The investors in New York wanted to know what the price of cotton was on the London stock market. Of course, slavery was well underway. You know, there was a cotton industry that was growing and growing. And so this was the news. This was basically any news, a letter from a friend, a letter from family. The continents were isolated at this time. There was no transatlantic telegraph. And it's hard for us to understand that. But that's what I think our desperation as humans to know what's going on drove the race to the Cape. And so Daniel Craig in New York City decided he wanted first access to the news coming from England. So he put the news boat at Cape Race. He hired 5 men, a captain and 4 guys, and they lived in a little telegraph hut next to the lighthouse at the headland of Cape Race. And every day they would go out in these tormented seas, these really vicious seas, and they would look for these canisters of mail and news being thrown overboard by the steamships. When they would locate those canisters of mail, they would then go back to the telegraph hut and they would telegraph the news to New York City in a matter of hours, as opposed to the days when the ship would arrive. So this is why the Race to the Cape was created. They wanted access to the news, and this was, they thought, was the best way to do it, but it was a very dangerous news chase.
What did you find out about Daniel Craig? Like, how did he end up chasing boats?
Yes, he was quite a character, actually, and I really quite admired him. He was from New Hampshire, and he was the youngest of 8 children in a big family. And his father died when he was very young. So he didn't have a patriarch helping him enter the world and helping him get into some occupation when he became a young man. So he decided he wanted to be a printer's apprentice, which was a thing at the time, a job at the time for printers. So he went to Baltimore, and there he worked with the Baltimore Sun. And under the tutelage of the editor of the Baltimore Sun, he really learned how to be a journalist. And they used carrier pigeons to go out to the then from Baltimore he moved to Boston, and then he moved to Halifax. And in Boston, what he did is he would go out in these rowboats to the outer side of the harbor in Boston, because it's kind of like in St. John's, Newfoundland. I don't know, maybe in Montreal too. The pilot boat has to bring in the ships through the Narrows into the harbor. And so that's what Daniel Craig would do. He would get up early in the morning. He would go down to the Boston harbor. He would jump into a rowboat. He would go outside the outer side of the harbor, climb on board the steamships, find out from the captain and the mail officer what was happening in Europe. And this, you have to understand too, like the ships, they were coming regularly, but I mean, some ships never made it because they were, shipwrecked or they got lost at sea. So some mail never arrived. It was a very dangerous experience. But Daniel Craig, he was unbeatable. And the AP in New York City hired him in 1850 out of Halifax because they knew he was unbeatable. He was just so good.
It's such incredible things that you found out. What was the thing that surprised you the most about the founding of the Associated Press?
The mere fact that you had 6 newspaper owners who were very competitive coming together and basically saying, okay, in the AP news dispatches, there will be no opinion. I mean, it really was the beginning of fact-based news. I mean, when I started researching this story, I was, approaching it. It was a family history story. My dad told me this story. The O'Learys are from Portugal Cove South, which is really right, the community next to Cape Race. So that's why he was always telling these stories about Cape Race. So for me, it was just like a family story I wanted to confirm. I didn't think I'd be telling the story about the beginning of journalism in North America and the beginning of fact-based news at a time when, we are really struggling in journalism with this whole issue between fake news and, fact-based news. But I think you'll find Race to the Cape interesting. Most people who've read it have naturally been making comparisons between then and now. And so I'm interested to see how people interpret all of that.
Theresa, thank you so much for joining us. This is so enlightening.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to discuss this with you. Thank you.
Theresa O'Leary is the author of Race to the Cape, The Daring News Chase, The Birth of the Associated Press, and the journalist at the heart of it all. The book is now available as a digital release or as a hard copy.